The freezing, sterile air of the Supreme Court of New South Wales seemed to settle deep into my marrow. I sat at the heavy oak defense table, my hands trembling, a rhythmic, involuntary tremor that I could not suppress despite every effort of will. I am Arthur Penhaligon. For 40 years, I have built a real estate portfolio that spans from the heart of Sydney's CBD to the expansive coastal estates of the North Shore. I have navigated the most aggressive boardrooms in the country and outlasted the most ruthless developers in the industry. Yet, sitting under the unforgiving glare of the courtroom lights, I appear to be nothing more than a frail, confused old man, exactly the image Sienna had spent 6 months meticulously crafting. Across the aisle sat Sienna. She was 45 years old, my wife of 12 years, and she was playing the role of her life. She wore a modest, navy blue tailored dress, her hair swept back in a style of disciplined elegance. She was completely stripped of the lavish diamonds and designer labels I had gifted her over the past decade. She sat with her head slightly bowed, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a crumpled silk handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with silent, calculated sobs. She was the perfect picture of an exhausted, battered spouse seeking safety from a husband whose mind had allegedly betrayed him. Standing beside her was her lead solicitor, a man whose hourly rate was, ironically, being paid by the very bank accounts he was now fighting to seize. He brandished a thick medical file like a weapon, his voice resonant and grave as he addressed the bench. He declared that my condition had deteriorated beyond the point of rehabilitation. He cited a sequence of fabricated medical reports, claiming that my mind was fractured, that I had become prone to volatile outbursts, and that I had become a direct physical threat to my family, particularly to my 10-year-old daughter, Isla. Listening to these assertions, a suffocating panic began to constrict my chest. The reality of the situation hit me with the force of an industrial collapse. I was not merely fighting for my assets, my properties, or the corporation that bore my name. I was fighting for my basic human autonomy. If the judge accepted this performance, if the gavel came down in Sienna's favor, I would be legally erased. I would be committed to a closed psychiatric facility, treated as a prisoner in my own mind, while Sienna and Julian, her son from a previous marriage, systematically liquidated everything I'd spent a lifetime building. I looked away from the judge and focused my gaze on Sienna. She lowered her handkerchief for a fleeting second, and our eyes met. The terrified victim persona vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness that chilled me more than the courtroom air. I looked down at her hands, resting on the plaintiff's table. They were perfectly manicured, steady, and poised. Those were the same hands that had poured my coffee every morning and adjusted my tie before every corporate gala. Now they were the exact same hands holding the legal knife poised at my throat. I sat motionless, a master builder watching the structural integrity of his own life being dismantled by the very people he had provided for, preparing to reveal the foundation I had hidden from them all along. The memory of the betrayal felt like a jagged shard of glass, cutting through the sterile atmosphere of the courtroom. 3 months ago, the transformation of my reality had begun with a precision that was almost artistic. I was sitting at the head of the mahogany boardroom table at Penhaligon Developments, the panoramic windows offering a view of the Sydney skyline that I had helped shape over 4 decades. My top executives were gathered, waiting for my final directive on a multi-million-dollar commercial acquisition. I was in command, every nerve center of the company responding to my lead. Then, the heavy glass doors swung open. It was not my secretary who entered, but a process server in a nondescript charcoal suit, carrying a thick stack of manila envelopes. He bypassed the security staff, marched straight to the head of the table, and dropped the documents onto my acquisition files with a dull, final thud. He looked me in the eye and stated, "Arthur Penhaligon, you are being served." The silence that followed was absolute. A vacuum where my authority used to be. My hands felt unnervingly numb as I pulled the papers from the envelope. It was a petition for guardianship and a temporary restraining order, accompanied by a preliminary injunction freezing my personal assets. The allegations were catastrophic: mental instability, dangerous behavioral patterns, and an inability to manage my own affairs. The humiliation was calculated, a public decapitation of my corporate identity intended to cast doubt on my competence before my own board. I remember the rush of adrenaline that followed, the frantic drive back to my North Shore estate, convinced that this had to be a malicious clerical error. I had trusted Sienna implicitly. I had mentored Julian for years, appointing him as my chief financial officer against the reservations of my partners. I had given him the keys to the kingdom because I believed in his potential. But when I reached the iron gates of my home, the illusion shattered. My access code flashed red. Sienna's code flashed red. The master override I had programmed 15 years ago, red. The system had been completely wiped. Beside the gate, my personal luggage, 6 expensive leather suitcases, sat dumped on the cobblestone driveway like unwanted refuse. As I stood there, bewildered, the mahogany door swung open, and Julian stepped out. He was not angry. He was disturbingly calm, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He didn't look at me like a father. He looked at me like a problem that was finally being resolved. He spoke with a sickening, polished concern that made my skin crawl. "Dad," he said softly, "you aren't well. We have seen the memory lapses and the confusion over the past 6 months. We're doing this to protect you, the company, and Isla." In that moment, watching him weaponize my fatigue and my private struggles against me, I realized that I had spent years grooming my own executioner. I had not just been outmaneuvered. I had been surgically erased from my own life. The transition from the grand estate of my North Shore life to the temporary, sterile suite at a Circular Quay hotel was an exercise in systematic degradation. My hands were still shaking, not from the phantom dementia they were so eager to diagnose, but from the raw, white-hot fury of being discarded like a faulty component. I spent that first night standing in the center of the room, listening to the deafening, oppressive hum of the central air conditioning. The suite was high-end, yet utterly devoid of history. It was a space designed for transit, for people who were passing through and leaving no mark, which was precisely why Sienna and Julian had chosen it. It was a cage of beige walls and sharp-edged furniture. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering expanse of the harbor. The lights of the city danced on the dark water, beautiful and indifferent to the wreckage of my existence. I was 70 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt the terrifying weight of absolute isolation. Every file I had moved, every contract I'd signed, and every bridge I'd crossed in the last 40 years had been built on a foundation of intellectual rigor. Now, that same mind was being framed as a liability. The phone on the nightstand rang, the sound jarring me back to the present. I stared at the device, my heart hammering against my ribs, until the rhythmic persistence forced me to answer. "Arthur," a voice said, Julian's voice. It was dripping with a synthetic, rehearsed empathy. "I know this is difficult, but you have to understand. We've reviewed the financial logs. Your recent decisions regarding the Riverina acquisition were erratic. The board is concerned, and we have to act in the best interest of the firm." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply listened, allowing him to weave his narrative of my incompetence. I needed him to continue believing that I was broken, that I was resigned to my fate, and that I lacked the faculties to challenge his coup. "I understand, Julian," I replied, my voice steady, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "I am tired. I just want to rest." The relief in his silence was palpable. He believed he had won. He believed the old man had finally bowed out, intimidated by the legal weight of his own health records. As soon as the call disconnected, I moved toward the desk. I needed to act before the net tightened further. I pulled a small, encrypted burner phone from my coat pocket, a precaution I had kept in my safe for years, a relic of a time when I managed high-stakes negotiations in the shadows of the industry. I dialed the number for Jonathan Carter. He was the only person in Sydney who wouldn't be compromised by Julian's influence. "Jonathan," I said, my voice dropping to a low, clinical tone. "They've triggered the guardianship petition. They have access to my accounts, and they've locked me out of the North Shore estate. I need a comprehensive audit of every asset, every subsidiary, and every trust we've established in the last 5 years. I need to know exactly how much they've moved, and more importantly, I need to know if they've touched the Riverina Trust. Jonathan didn't hesitate. I'll start immediately, Arthur. But you must remain in character. If they detect even a hint of your former self, they'll accelerate the legal process to ensure you're permanently incapacitated. I hung up the phone and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I wasn't the man they thought they were erasing. I was a man who had built an empire by identifying structural vulnerabilities and exploiting them. And now, I was standing inside their operation, ready to bring the entire facade crashing down. The game hadn't ended. It had simply shifted to a terrain where they were entirely unprepared to survive. The following 3 days were an exercise in meticulous, agonizing performance. I navigated the hotel with the deliberate, faltering gait of a man whose world was narrowing into a haze of confusion. I left my keys in obvious places, made a show of misplacing my spectacles, and kept the television at a volume that was barely audible, a necessary degradation to ensure the trap remained sprung. I knew Julian and Sienna were monitoring me, either through hotel staff or the very devices I had once installed for my own protection. Every sigh, every slow blink, and every fumbled attempt at using the hotel's coffee machine was part of the narrative they were feeding to the court-appointed guardians. I spent most of my time in the suite, listening to the cadence of the city outside and the silence within. It was a humiliating charade. They treated my life as if it were a foreclosure sale, their arrogance blinding them to the reality that a man who has spent 40 years navigating corporate volatility does not simply surrender his legacy. They viewed me as a sunset, a closing act they were eager to hasten. They didn't see a father or a business partner. They saw an account balance to be liquidated. I caught glimpses of their progress through the digital dashboard I had maintained on my encrypted laptop. Julian was working around the clock, his activity logs showing a flurry of transfers into obscure holding entities registered in the Cayman Islands. He was not just preparing to take over Penhaligon developments. He was systematically draining the operating capital. He was siphoning the lifeblood of my company while keeping me sedated and confused. The sheer scale of his embezzlement was breathtaking. If these transfers continued at this pace, the company would be insolvent within months. He was framing it as an emergency restructuring, using my alleged cognitive decline as the ultimate excuse for sudden, inexplicable vulnerability. It was a masterclass in corporate treason. He believed he was outmaneuvering me, but he was failing to notice the most elementary detail of the game. I had built the architecture of this empire on a foundation of contingencies he was not even aware existed. The psychological warfare was the most difficult aspect to endure. There were moments of doubt, crushing waves of fatigue, and vertigo that made me question if I was losing my mind, just as they claimed. I would sit on the edge of the bed, my hands pulsing with that rhythmic, metallic tremor, and wonder if I had truly broken the porcelain vase in the foyer last week, as Sienna had tearfully insisted. I had no memory of the event, but the shattered fragments had been so real. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to hold my fracturing mind together. But then, the clarity would return, sharp and cold as a razor. It was not dementia. It was a reaction to the persistent, sluggish fog that clung to me whenever I had consumed the custom health supplement Sienna had insisted upon for months. My skepticism was my survival. I realized that the tremor was not a symptom of decay, but a calculated effect of a life I had been forced to live. Every act of forgetfulness, every moment of instability they recorded was a brick they were adding to the structure of their own downfall. I was the architect of their demise, and I was simply waiting for the structural supports of their greed to buckle under the weight of their own arrogance. The opportunity for the next phase of the counteroffensive arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by an unexpected and ultimately heartbreaking source. I had been granted a strictly supervised visitation session with my daughter, Isla, at a quiet public park in the inner west of Sydney. The court order was clear: 60 minutes of interaction, monitored by a social worker, with Sienna standing barely 10 meters away, her eyes shielded by dark glasses, watching like a hawk. I arrived early, sitting on a bench that felt cold and indifferent. My posture was purposefully slumped, my hands resting limply in my lap to maintain the facade of the broken pensioner. When a social worker arrived with Isla, my heart contracted. She looked smaller, more fragile than I remembered. She walked with her head bowed, her hands shoved deep in her coat pockets, her posture echoing the crushing weight of a household now dominated by Julian's cold ambition and Sienna's calculated cruelty. She approached me with a hesitation that was the most painful thing I have ever witnessed. This was a girl who used to spend hours in my study, chattering endlessly about science projects and art while I reviewed architectural plans. Now, she looked like a prisoner of war. She sat across from me at the picnic table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, picking at her cuticles until they were raw. I tried to bridge the distance, asking about her school, her books, the simple rhythms of her life, but she answered in clipped, terrified syllables. She kept darting panicked glances toward Sienna, who stood by the playground fence, a silhouette of malice. "You know I love you, right?" I whispered, keeping my voice light and conversational for the benefit of the social worker. "No matter what happens, you are the most important person in the world to me." Isla nodded slowly, a single tear escaping to roll down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, throwing another terrified glance over her shoulder. The hour evaporated with agonizing speed. As the social worker signaled the end of the session, Isla broke her silent terror. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around my waist, burying her face into my overcoat. It was a desperate, fleeting embrace. But in that second, while my body shielded her from Sienna's line of sight, I felt a sudden, deliberate movement. Her small hand jammed something roughly into the inner pocket of my jacket. The movement was so quick, so desperate, that if I hadn't been hyper-aware of her every breath, I would have missed it entirely. "That is enough, Arthur." Sienna's voice cut through the air, sharp and aggressive. She marched over, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete, and physically peeled Isla away from me. I remained on my knees for a second too long, watching them retreat toward the black SUV, my hands hovering over my coat pocket, feeling the faint, textured lump of the object she had hidden there. I didn't dare pull it out in the park. I walked, with a forced, steady pace, to a public restroom near the recreational center. The silence of the tiled stall was broken only by my shallow breathing. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't the tremor of illness. It was pure, focused adrenaline. I pulled out the small object. It was a tiny, crumpled piece of lined notebook paper torn hastily from spiral binder. Written in pencil, in Isla's jagged, terrified handwriting, were 7 words that completely altered the trajectory of my war. "Dad, do not drink the orange juice." The air left my lungs. The realization hit me with the force of a landslide. For 6 months, Sienna had insisted I take a custom-blended liquid supplement every night, claiming it was for my heart health. She had meticulously mixed it into fresh orange juice, standing over my desk to watch me consume every drop. I realized, with a clarity, that was both horrifying and illuminating, that my brain fog, my tremors, and my memory lapses only ever occurred late at night, shortly after I finished her nightly tonic. I was not dying of early-onset dementia. I was being slowly, methodically poisoned. The foundation of their deception was built on a chemical lie, and now I had the key to dismantle it piece by piece. The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. I stood in the harsh, flickering light of the public restroom, clutching that jagged scrap of paper as if it were a blueprint for my own survival. Isla had seen the truth. A 10-year-old child had navigated the shadows of that house with more clarity than I had possessed for months. I leaned against the cold tile wall, letting the air in my lungs stabilize. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being chemically dismantled by the very person who had vowed to cherish it. I traced the timeline of my decline with the cold, unforgiving precision of an engineer inspecting a site of catastrophic failure. 6 months ago, Sienna had returned from a wellness retreat with a newfound, obsessive concern for my cardiovascular health. She had introduced the supplement, and within weeks, the fog had begun to settle. The memory lapses, the dizzy spells, the paralyzing vertigo, they were never medical symptoms. They were physiological responses to a carefully titrated cocktail of neurotoxins. I had been consuming my own destruction, one crystal glass at a time, while Sienna watched with the patience of a predator. My hands, once the source of my deepest shame, were suddenly still. I held them out in front of me, fingers splayed wide against the tiled wall. The tremor was fading, not because of medicine, but because of abstinence. For the past 3 days, since the moment I was locked out of my estate, I hadn't touched a single drop of her concoction. My central nervous system was beginning to repair itself. I rotated my wrists, clenching my fingers into tight, powerful fists. The strength I thought had abandoned me forever was still there, dormant but entirely intact. A wave of profound, chilling clarity washed over me, followed by a rage so deep and cold. It felt like liquid nitrogen pumping through my veins. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a systematic, clinical assassination attempt. They had weaponized my trust, my love, and my age to render me a helpless invalid, all to facilitate a massive corporate coup. But they had made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. By banishing me to the hotel, they had inadvertently cut off my supply of the poison. They had handed me the one thing I needed to connect the dots, the gift of time. I splashed freezing water on my face, scrubbing away the pathetic, defeated old man who had sat crying in the park just minutes prior. I looked into the cracked mirror, locking eyes with my own reflection. The gray, lifeless complexion was already giving way to a sharp, predatory focus. The fog was lifting, and the brilliant real estate magnate who had conquered the Sydney skyline was waking up from a 6-month chemical coma. I folded Isla's note and tucked it securely into my breast pocket, right next to my heart. My daughter had risked everything to save my life, and now it was my turn to save hers. I walked out of the restroom, the biting winter wind of Sydney no longer bothering me at all. I didn't look back toward the street where Sienna's SUV had disappeared. My pace quickened with every block, the adrenaline sharpening my senses. I had the truth, I had the evidence, and, for the first time in months, I had the initiative. The demolition of their deception had begun, and I wouldn't stop until every brick they had laid was turned to dust. I retreated to the quiet, nondescript hotel room, the walls no longer feeling like a prison, but like a tactical command center. My first move was to secure irrefutable scientific evidence, a weapon no defense solicitor could disassemble. I had already identified a private, high-end forensic laboratory in the northern suburbs of Sydney that specialized in toxicology and heavy metal analysis. I walked there under the cover of dusk, wearing a simple cap and a nondescript jacket, paying entirely in cash using a fabricated alias. The intake nurse was efficient and asked no questions about my out-of-state driver's license or my demand for complete anonymity. She took vials of blood and, crucially, a cluster of hair from the base of my scalp. The hair test was my insurance policy. While blood would only reflect the past few days, the follicles would provide a precise, chronological timeline of every substance introduced into my system for the last 6 months. It would pinpoint the exact day the poison was first administered, cementing Sienna's evening tonic into an undeniable timeline of criminal intent. After the draw, I drove aimlessly through the industrial outskirts of Alexandria, navigating the maze of dark, cracked roads until I reached a prearranged meeting point near a shipping warehouse. Mitchell Reed was waiting there. Mitchell had been my primary corporate counsel decades ago, back when I was a hungry contractor hustling for permits to build my first warehouse. He had long since retired from the public eye to run a private practice for a select few clients who valued absolute discretion, but he had never lost his predatory edge. He looked up from his tablet as I slid into the passenger seat of his car, his pale blue eyes piercing. "You look different, Arthur," he observed, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I feel different," I replied, handing him a printed summary of my financial analysis. My mind is clear, Mitchell. I've been chemically dismantled for half a year. They've been feeding me a cocktail of neurotoxins and synthetic sedatives to mimic early-onset dementia. I have the samples being processed right now to prove it. Mitchell didn't react with shock. He responded with the cold, hardened fury of a professional. He reviewed the financial logs, the wire transfers to the offshore shell companies Julian had created, the emergency consulting fees siphoned from the operating capital. "They are bleeding you out, Arthur," he said, not looking up from the page. Systematically and with extreme sophistication. Julian isn't just taking over. He's engineering a total liquidation of Penhaligon Developments. "I don't want a defense solicitor, Mitchell," I said, my voice dropping to an icy register. "I want an executioner. I want to build a legal guillotine, and I want them to be the ones to pull the lever." Mitchell offered a dark, humorless smile. "We won't just block their moves. We're going to obliterate their playing field. If we confront them now with mere suspicion, they'll file for an emergency psychiatric hold and use the medical record Sienna has curated to claim you're paranoid. We have to operate in the dark." He began outlining the counter-strategy. He would move the remainder of my personal fortune into a new, irrevocable trust where I was the beneficiary, but he was the sole trustee. The moment Julian tried to access my personal accounts to finalize his coup, he would hit a wall of absolute legal finality. Meanwhile, Mitchell would contact his old connections within the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, to place a covert, silent flag on every single account associated with Julian shell companies. Every stolen dollar Julian wired would simply provide more evidence for a federal fraud investigation. They would continue their campaign, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had been hollowed out. By the time they realized their empire was built on sand, they would be staring down a prison sentence that would outlast their stolen wealth. I looked out at the dark warehouse, feeling the cold, resonant calm of a man who was no longer just protecting his home, but actively orchestrating the collapse of the deception that had poisoned his family. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for them to walk onto the site. The next phase of the operation required the most difficult performance of my life. I had to return to the hotel and inhabit the persona of the broken, senile relic they desperately needed me to be. I spent the following days in an agonizing state of suspended animation. I paced the floorboards of the hotel suite until my feet ached, my mind mapping out 1,000 contingencies. Every time I looked at the digital clock on a nightstand, I felt a physical pain in my chest. I knew that with every passing hour, Julian was siphoning off more capital, bleeding my life's work dry. I had to force myself to stay away from the company ledgers. I couldn't risk Julian noticing a phantom login while Mitchell was setting the trap with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC. I had to let them continue their theft. I had to sit in the deafening silence of that hotel room and watch the water rise, trusting the process. The helplessness was a unique form of torture, yet it was the only way to ensure the cage was fully locked. However, the financial hemorrhage was not the true source of my agony. The nightmare that kept me awake was the vivid image of Isla. My 10-year-old daughter was trapped within the walls of the North Shore estate, surrounded by people who were actively orchestrating the destruction of her father. I wondered if Sienna was watching her with the same predatory intensity she had applied to me. Was she safe? Was she hiding in her room, waiting for me to rescue her? The thought of Sienna placing her manicured hands on my child filled me with a primal, violent rage that threatened to shatter my composure. I wanted to storm the house, to tear the gates from their hinges, and carry Isla away from that toxic environment. But I knew that was exactly what they wanted. If I showed up in an outburst of righteous fury, the police would be called, the guardianship would be finalized immediately, and I would be locked away in a high-security facility, leaving Isla at their total mercy. I had to be a ghost. I had to swallow my pride and my absolute fury, channeling every ounce of my energy into the snare. I practiced my tremors, ensuring my hands shook with the exact biological rhythm of a failing nervous system. I practiced slurring my speech, dropping my gaze and becoming the hollow shell they needed. It was a humiliating, degrading exercise, but it was the armor I had to wear to reach the finish line. By the fourth afternoon, the weight of the isolation began to distort my perception of time. The beige walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and stale. I questioned if Julian's security team had swept his digital infrastructure and discovered the hidden monitoring arrays I had authorized Victor to plant. Doubt is the enemy of a well-laid plan, and my mind was a fertile breeding ground for paranoia. Just as the sun began to dip below the city skyline, casting long gray shadows across the carpet, the disposable phone finally vibrated. The harsh buzz shattered the oppressive silence of the suite. I lunged forward, grabbing the device with steady, powerful hands. The screen illuminated, displaying a single, encrypted web link. Victor had breached the fortress. I booted up my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys with ruthless precision. I downloaded the first batch of compressed audio files and connected my noise-canceling headphones. The agonizing wait was over. The hunt for my family's salvation had officially begun. The audio quality was terrifyingly crisp, capturing the cold acoustics of the executive office. I sat in the dim light of my hotel suite, the noise-canceling headphones pressing tightly against my ears, bracing myself for the cold logistics of my financial ruin. I heard the distinct thud of the solid mahogany office door closing, followed by the metallic click of a deadbolt engaging from the inside. Then a silence stretched across the recording, an agonizing, suffocating stillness. I expected the clatter of a keyboard or the rustle of ledger pages. Instead, I heard a soft, unmistakable sigh. Then came the whispering. It was Sienna. Her voice was low, breathless, and saturated with a sickening, intimate familiarity. I froze, my heart seizing in my chest as the truth began to unfold. She murmured Julian's name, drawing the syllables out in a slow, agonizing purr. I heard the rustling of expensive fabric and the distinct sound of a silk blouse slipping against leather upholstery. Then Julian responded, his voice thick with raw, unfiltered desire. The audio feed captured the sound of an aggressive, intimate exchange that completely shattered the foundation of my reality. This was not a clandestine business meeting to discuss offshore shell corporations. This was a grotesque, depraved manifestation of ultimate betrayal. My wife and the young man I had raised as my own son were carrying on a repulsive, incestuous affair within the very walls of my company. I sat paralyzed, physically unable to tear the headphones away as the audio painted a graphic, undeniable picture of their absolute moraldica. They were uninhibited, laughing softly as they discarded their clothing. Between heavy breaths, Sienna whispered about how incredibly gullible I was, mocking the way I trembled in my chair while she handed me my nightly poison. Julian laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. He praised her for being such a brilliant, ruthless actress, noting how effectively she played the role of the devoted wife. The betrayal ripped through me, severing every remaining tether of empathy I possessed. The financial theft, the corporate coup, and the systematic chemical poisoning paled in comparison to the sheer, repulsive sickness of this specific revelation. They were not just stealing my assets. They were making a mockery of my life, my marriage, and the very concept of family. A violent wave of nausea surged from the pit of my stomach. I ripped the headphones off, the plastic frame cracking against the edge of the glass table as I threw them down. I collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving, my throat burning with unspeakable disgust. The cold hotel carpet offered no comfort. The sounds of their laughter continued to loop relentlessly inside my head. The ultimate depth of their depravity was incomprehensible. I had welcomed Julian into my home, paid for his education, and handed him the keys to $1 billion empire. I had trusted Sienna with my health and my secrets. They had repaid that devotion by turning my marriage bed into a sick, twisted joke. I slowly pushed myself up, my muscles aching with an exhausted, rigid tension. I turned on the faucet and splashed freezing water over my face, scrubbing at my skin until it was raw. Lifting my gaze to meet my reflection, the man looking back was completely transformed. The shocked, grieving husband was dead. The loving father who had desperately wanted to believe in the goodness of his family was gone forever. Only a ruthless, focused predator remained. I sat back down at the table, picking up the headphones with deliberate, steady precision. I had to know every detail of their endgame, regardless of the cost to my own sanity. The hunt had stopped being about recovery. It had become a hunt for total, absolute justice. The audio resumed, and I forced myself to endure the sound of their casual, toxic intimacy. Julian, his voice returning to that arrogant, professional cadence he used in board meetings, began detailing the terminal stage of his strategy. The scale of the treason was staggering. He was not merely siphoning operating capital into offshore accounts. He was engineering a complete, catastrophic detonation of my corporate legacy. Julian was negotiating a hostile, backroom takeover with Sterling Horizon, my most aggressive corporate rival. For 40 years, I had fought Sterling for every major commercial contract in New South Wales. Now, my own stepson was handing them the keys to the castle. Julian was arranging to sell my entire commercial real estate portfolio for a fraction of its market value, intentionally tanking the company's valuation to manufacture a panic. In exchange for gifting my empire to my worst enemy, Julian was receiving a massive, untraceable kickback. I listened as he recited the routing numbers for a series of accounts in Cyprus, where Sterling Horizon was quietly wiring him precisely $20 million for his corporate espionage. They began to openly mock my deteriorating state, laughing at how easily I had surrendered my agency. Sienna bragged about her meticulous nightly routine, detailing with chilling enthusiasm exactly how she ground the sedatives into a fine powder, masking the bitter chemical taste within the citrus. She called me a pathetic, trusting relic, reveling in the moment I had dropped the silver pen during the mediation. They were giddy with their success, convinced that they had successfully weaponized my age, my trust, and my health against me. Then, Julian laid out the final timeline. To finalize the ultimate transfer of assets, they required my permanent, irrevocable removal from the public eye. Julian explained that the temporary guardianship was insufficient to push the sale past the remaining skeptical board members. They had arranged for a specialized transport team to arrive at my hotel early on Monday morning. They planned to have me forcefully committed to a high-security psychiatric facility. Sienna explained that this facility was notorious for its restrictive environment, where they would heavily sedate me and block all outside communication. Once I was locked behind those reinforced doors, any protest I made, any accusation of poisoning or embezzlement, will be documented as a textbook symptom of my paranoid delirium. I would scream the truth into a void, and my captors would simply increase the dosage until my mind finally shattered. With me permanently buried, Julian would possess the absolute legal authority to sign over the final property deeds. They intended to vanish by Friday, fleeing to a luxury villa they had secretly acquired in a remote territory in South America. The audio ended with the sound of them clinking their crystal glasses, toasting to their future. I removed the headphones, setting them down with deliberate care. The silence in the hotel suite was no longer empty. It was thick with the clarity of a death warrant. They had built a perfect maze designed to strip me of my wealth, my freedom, and my sanity. They viewed me not as a husband or a father, but as a temporary obstacle to be discarded. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally malicious, that it severed every lingering tether of humanity I possessed. They had given me a deadline. I had exactly 5 days before the transport team arrived. 5 days to systematically burn their entire world to the ground. The final audio file, the one I had hesitated to play, was short, but it carried the weight of a final, irrevocable judgment. The office was quiet, the ambient hum of the Sydney night bleeding through the window. I heard the rustle of a suit jacket, the sound of Julian preparing to depart, and then, a question that made my blood run cold. Are we entirely sure we have covered every single loose end? Julian's voice was clipped, businesslike. The psychiatric transport is confirmed for Monday morning. We have the leverage. The board is managed. Is there anything else before we head to the airport on Friday? There was a chilling silence. Then Sienna spoke. Her voice lacked the seductive, breathy tone she used earlier. It was flat, deeply annoyed, and terrifyingly detached. We need to figure out what we're going to do with Isla, she said. Hearing my 10-year-old daughter's name spoken by that woman sent a violent physical shockwave through me. Julian sighed, a sound of dismissive irritation. The child? We can't leave her at the estate once the old man is hauled off to the facility. The state will step in, and they'll start asking questions we don't want to answer. Sienna scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. Do not worry about the girl. I have already made arrangements. The moment Arthur is legally declared incompetent, I am executing my rights as her custodial stepmother. I've enrolled her in a remote disciplinary boarding school outside of Switzerland. It is essentially a high-altitude juvenile prison with strict communication blackouts. I'm putting her on a direct commercial flight Tuesday morning. And if she fights? Julian asked, his voice barely betraying a hint of hesitation. What if she starts screaming that we poison her father? Sienna laughed, a cruel, soulless sound that echoed in the quiet office. Let her talk. She is just a grieving, traumatized child who watched her father descend into madness. No one will believe a word. They will just sedate her and lock her in a dormitory. And if the boarding school refuses to keep her, I'll sign over my guardianship to the state foster system. I do not care what happens to her. I am finished playing the mother to his offspring. The audio ended with the sharp, clinical click of a light switch, followed by the heavy, echoing thud of the mahogany door. I sat perfectly frozen in the dim light of my hotel room. The silence that filled the suite was no longer empty. It was thick, suffocating, and heavy with the scale of their depravity. They were not just stealing my life's work. They were discarding my daughter like garbage. My breathing settled into a rhythmic, terrifying cadence. The nausea that had overwhelmed me earlier was gone, replaced by an absolute, freezing calm. Every lingering shred of mercy I might have harbored for the woman I once called my wife, or the man I had raised as a son, evaporated into the night air. They had crossed a moral boundary that could never be uncrossed. My sweet Isla had risked everything to warn me. She had seen the monsters hiding behind the smiles, and she had bravely tried to save me. Now, it was my undeniable duty to save her. I reached for the burner phone and dialed Mitchell Reed's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice steady in the darkness. Mitchell, I said, my voice resonating with a lethal, unwavering certainty. We are changing the plan and moving the entire timeline forward. The waiting period is over. Initiate the banking alerts immediately. Spring the trap. Mitchell didn't ask a single question. He simply confirmed the new directives and disconnected. The gears of our hidden machine locked into place, accelerating the inevitable collision. I stood up, squared my shoulders, and felt the weight of the last few months lift. I was no longer a victim waiting for the end. I was an architect preparing for the final demolition. The game was over, and they had absolutely no idea they were already standing in the blast zone. The morning of the final hearing dawned with a piercing, crystalline light that cut through the smog of the city. I arrived at the Supreme Court of New South Wales not as a broken man, but as a deliberate architect of justice. My suit was meticulously pressed, my movements were steady, and the tremors that had once defined my illness were nothing more than a memory, a performance piece I had long since discarded. Across the center aisle, Sienna and Julian sat flanked by their high-priced legal team. They radiated the smug, untouchable confidence of people who believed their heist was nearing its perfect conclusion. They had no idea they were walking into a slaughterhouse. Their lead solicitor, Harrison, stood to address the bench, his voice dripping with rehearsed, sycophantic sorrow. He painted a masterful portrait of my tragic decline, citing forged medical reports and fabricated incidents of aggression with a clinical, chilling precision. He requested the final guardianship order, which would permanently transfer the entirety of my estate and corporate holdings to his clients. The judge, a man with tired eyes and a sense of gravity that usually commanded respect, looked down at me with a profound, crushing pity. He began to reach for the gavel, preparing to sign away my existence, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber swung open. Isla stood in the center aisle, clutching a tablet to her chest. Beside her stood the social worker, looking confused and entirely out of place. My daughter's eyes were locked onto mine for a fleeting second, a silent exchange of courage, before she turned to the bench. "May I show you something that Dad does not even know about, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence of the room. Before the opposition could scramble an objection, the tablet was connected to the courtroom's digital monitors. The footage that played was captured from a hidden camera in the kitchen of our North Shore estate. It was undeniable. It showed Sienna meticulously crushing sedatives into a fine powder, blending them into my orange juice, and stirring the lethal concoction while Julian embraced her from behind. It captured their laughter, their mockery of my failing mind, and their cold-blooded discussion regarding my impending commitment and Isla's exile to a disciplinary prison. The courtroom atmosphere disintegrated. The judge's mask of pity fractured, replaced by a rigid, white-hot professional outrage. Sienna screamed, her composure shattering instantly as she lunged toward the monitors, but the bailiff intercepted her with swift, decisive force. Julian, the arrogant architect of my ruin, collapsed into his chair, his face a ghostly, translucent mask of terror. Mitchell Reed rose smoothly, his presence as commanding as a rising tide. He laid the toxicology reports and the federal audit logs directly onto the judge's desk. "Your Honor," Mitchell stated, his voice cutting through the chaos, "my client is the victim of systematic chemical poisoning, international wire fraud, and attempted homicide." Before Julian could scramble for the emergency exit, federal investigators moved into the chamber with the cold efficiency of a tactical unit. Handcuffs clicked, a sharp, metallic sound that signaled the definitive end of their conspiracy. As they were dragged out, their expensive suits looking absurdly out of place against the reality of their crimes, I didn't feel the urge to gloat. I felt only a profound, resonant finality. I walked to the witness stand, knelt down, and embraced Isla. She was the one who had refused to let the darkness prevail. I had lost the wife I thought I knew and the son I had trusted, but I had regained my life, my dignity, and the future of my daughter. As the judge struck the gavel, not to end my autonomy, but to sentence my betrayers, I looked out the window at the Sydney skyline. The structures I had built remained, and for the first time in an eternity, the foundation beneath my feet was entirely my own. The demolition was complete. The rot had been excised, and the rebuilding could finally begin.